We ready? Okay. Apologies for those of you that are stuck in the back with standing room only. I'd fit more chairs in here, but I don't think it's possible. So sorry if it gets a little hot, but I guess just get nice and friendly with your neighbor. I'm Abby Fuller. I'm from AWS. I'm a technology evangelist, so I go around places, just a fancy way of saying that I'm a regular engineer that goes in and talks to people and does builders days instead. So welcome to the State of the Union. We will be doing these in every track today. So there's a containers one, a serverless one, and an AI machine learning one. This will be probably the least technical talk of the day. So this is around a 200 level. It should be a little bit of an intro, what you can expect from the rest of the day, and can point you in the right direction of the sessions that you can sit in the rest of the afternoon. So we'll do this. And then we have some sessions coming up later. So those will all be deep dives. So we'll have a Kubernetes deep dive, a Fargate deep dive, an ECS deep dive, and we'll have one, the very last one will be on advanced container management and scheduling. So we will press on with this one. If you have a question, we'll leave about 15 minutes for questions at the end. If your question absolutely cannot wait, which is totally fine, definitely feel free to either raise a hand so I know that you're trying to say something and someone will come along with the mic. So we're on Twitch, so or we're broadcasting, so make sure that you wait for a mic so that the people watching from home can hear as well. Okay, so housekeeping done. First things first, because I've done a couple containers talks at this point, and every once in a while there's the person that comes up afterwards after a whole talk and says, but I don't understand what containers are. And that's fine. So what are containers and why are customers using them? So the easiest definition here, it's an atomic piece of like a self-contained package of software. So what does atomic and self-contained means? It has everything it needs to run itself. So that means your code, that means your runtime, that means any packages or requirements, any libraries. A really widely used format for this is Docker containers. So you run them, something like Docker run, Docker build, Docker push. But basically, you have a Docker image that outlines everything that you need to run and build your application. It's in a self-contained little box. And then once you've built it, you can deploy those to any kind of infrastructure you'd like. So you can have a Windows container, a Linux container, running any kind of different languages. It all fits inside that box. And anticipating the follow-up question is, but Abby, that sounds an awful lot like a VM. And I think I already have VMs. And I don't think that Docker invented the VM. And that's true. So what's the main? So there's a really good blog post on this, by the way, by a girl named Jessie Frizzell, that she wrote a whole long post on the difference between jails and VMs and containers. This is not, obviously, a whole blog post. It is just a graphic that I stole from the internet. So if you'd like to know more about this, definitely head towards the blog post first if you want any deeper questions answered. Main difference comes down to, though, that containers are isolated, but they share the host OS. And in a lot of cases, they also share things like libraries or packages. So they are isolated, but they do share that base OS with all the other containers. Containers are really popular, obviously based on the state of the room. So we've gotten to a point where they come up more and more and more. And why are people using this format? For the people that are trying to come in, you have to come in the back, I think, if you can come in at all. Godspeed. Oh, yeah. Say hi, you're on Twitch. OK, maybe we need a sign or something. So why are these so popular? So this is obviously a very cursory search of everyone's favorite troll site, Hacker News. An incredible amount of people are making this move. And maybe a couple years ago, actually, maybe still happening still for a lot of enterprises, there's the whole monolith to microservices story. So what was that? So people started off and they had what we call monoliths now. So big single pieces of architecture. So my monolithic application had many functions, and not functions necessarily as in programming functions, but it had many jobs. Well, also many programming functions, but it had many jobs. So a messaging service, a UI service, a friend service, a graph service, those would all be part of the same overarching service. So it might be a single repository in GitHub. You deployed everything all at once. And deploying to that single monolith required changing the whole thing all at once. So you ended up, in a lot of cases, with something called spaghetti code. So pieces that were all interconnected. So you end up with that everyone's favorite DevOps problem, which is I pushed to production, and now this other thing that seemed totally unrelated is now also messed up. So what people were looking for is a different way of doing things. So a way that was a little bit more flexible. It was a little bit easier to deploy, a little bit easier to work with. And that's where a lot of folks ended up with containers. So super portable, super lightweight. The container itself is standardized, so that box that I deploy my software in, but inside it doesn't have to be standard at all. So standard format, not standard contents, but I could have a service in Ruby, a service in Python, a service in Go, a service in Java, all packaged the same way. So I could use the same deployment scaffolding to move those containers around, but I was no longer limited by, well, that other guy that was here 6 years before me, he really liked Java, so now all of our infrastructure's in Java, so now I have to work with Java, or I have to figure out some way to make a second service and then call my second service from my first service. So those kind of go hand in hand. And for AWS, I think the story for us really starts in 2014. So we've had customers that were running Docker on EC2 from the very beginning. So Docker is obviously open source. You can use it yourself. You can build and run Docker containers yourself. And an EC2 server is just a server. So I could build, run, ship my own Docker containers on these EC2 servers. But people weren't super happy with that. So it's great. And in a lot of cases, you can still do that. And well, you can still do that today. But what people were saying is that they had a lot of pain points with this. So it's no surprise, I think, that a monolith, in a lot of ways, is easy because all you're doing is pushing, building, and running kind of one piece. And it might not be a super efficient piece. It might not be using its resources super effectively. It might have spaghetti code. You might be unhappy with it. But ultimately, it's one piece for you to manage and build and deploy. And with containers, they were like, well, so all these benefits are pretty great. But now I'm managing hundreds, or in a lot of cases, thousands of little boxes. And that's a lot more work than I'm willing to put into it. So things like scheduling, managing the containers, managing the underlying infrastructure, all of those were kind of pain points. So we built ECS. So container management system. So managed way to take care of all of those pain points. So the cluster management. So how do I manage the underlying infrastructure? So the EC2 instances that are registered to that cluster that I can place the containers onto. Container orchestration, which is how do I schedule the containers themselves. So how do I know that this container should go on server A and these two containers should go on server B. And the managed part of that, beyond the we're helping you out, is the deep AWS integration. And I think that's a phrase that we throw around a lot. And what does that actually mean? So it means that you can use things like IAM or Route 53 or Autoscaling groups. So the same kind of AWS-y concepts that you could use with EC2 boxes, you can use with other services. And then I can call those services from within ECS. So that might mean that in ECS, I can register my EC2 instances that make up my cluster to an auto-scaling group with a launch configuration. Or I can use Route 53 for service discovery. So that's what we mean by deep AWS integration. I'm on my 4th time zone, by the way, so if I can't say a word, you can blame jet lag. I'm not even sure if it's jet lag or jet forward anymore. So people were using ECS. So this is Segment. They're a marketing data startup. They run the majority of their services on ECS. So they were pretty happy with this. So these are some, I think these numbers have gone up since I got them from them, but they process around 160 billion analytics events per month. So that's up to 270,000 a second. They do that on ECS. They use auto-scaling and something called bin packing to both utilize the full amount of the instances that are part of their cluster, and then auto-scaling on top of that to scale their infrastructure to keep up with this event-driven architecture. ECS isn't just for event processing, though. So they also run something called ETL jobs through ECS. So ETL, extract, transform, and load. So they pull data from customer sources like an app or their integration. They funnel it through ECS in a series of really short-running jobs, and then they dump the results of that to Redshift. So what people were finding is that containers could serve a lot of different use cases. So you have the traditional kind of web, the three-tier web app, where I have a proxy or something in front of my app, and it's connected to a database or some third-party services. You had that, but people were also starting to use containers for more and more of their other kinds of infrastructure. So batch jobs, batch processing, running services in response to another kind of event. They were using these container jobs for all kinds of workloads. But no surprises here. ECS is not the only way to run containers in production. There's something called Kubernetes. And we were finding that more customers were running Kubernetes on AWS than anywhere else. So companies like Manzo, so local favorite, where I can't get a Manzo card still. They won't come to the US. So Manzo, obviously, financial tech startup here. They run just Kubernetes on AWS. So in their case, it's just Kubernetes on EC2. So I think they've... I think I'm going to put a sign up. So they run more than 350 microservices, just Kubernetes on EC2. So they manage it themselves. They scale it themselves. They're responsible for doing that. If you've never worked with Kubernetes yourself before, one of the biggest challenges is high availability. And if you're from Manzo, I'm sorry that I got the wrong logo. My slides used to be white, and I didn't realize until just now. Part of the problem is high availability, right? And you have multiple parts in Kubernetes where it's important to have high availability. And for a lot of people, that means, well, what do I do if my master fails? What do I do if my backing store of etcd fails? So Manzo, high availability at every level. I think that's extra important for banking, right? Like, if I want to go and use my card, I probably don't want to not be able to spend my money because my bank is having planned or unplanned downtime. So I think there are some services that you can still, so like government websites maybe, that have planned downtime where they go and they fix some stuff. Maybe they change their schema in their database. Definitely not even in American banking would that fly. So really important to have high availability at every level. So that means multiple masters, hundreds of workers, and then highly available etcd behind the back. Obviously, though, security is important too. So they use something called Direct Connect to go from their third-party resources like payment processors and then connect that securely to their AWS resources inside their VPC. I'm sure that Manzo is very tired of people sharing this quote around, but I'm going to get it one more time. So this is a really nice quote from them, well, nice, in a blog post when they were writing about their experience with Kubernetes. And they said that deploying Kubernetes in a highly available configuration on AWS is not for the faint of heart and requires you to get familiar with its internals. But we are very pleased with the results. That is pretty much a very common response for running Kubernetes yourself. It's a great service. It does a lot of things very powerfully. It integrates third-party APIs extremely well. The open source community around it is very vibrant. But it is a lot of work. Running it in a highly available way is a lot of work. And it's really easy to go and write a Medium post that says, hey, I set up Kubernetes in a weekend. I don't know what all you jerks are talking about. But what's really hard is running that in production at scale in a way that's highly available and fault tolerant. So not for the faint of heart. And a theme for a lot of people then was run Kubernetes for me. I still want to use this, but I want a little help running it. So we built EKS. So platform for you to run enterprise-grade managed Kubernetes. So upstream, so to answer the most frequently asked question, but is it special Amazon Kubernetes? And the answer is no. It is just regular people Kubernetes. So manage Kubernetes upstream. So if we do something, we both pull changes from Kubernetes, but also if we did something cool, we'll push it back upstream as well. Same native integration as ECS, plus playing nicely with the open source community. So not special Kubernetes, but Kubernetes for the people. And that's a theme here, I think, in general. So that started with Docker on EC2, that went to ECS, that went to Kubernetes on EC2, that went to EKS. And that's run my containers for me. I want to use them. This is an architecture choice that I'm really invested in, and I like all the benefits. It's portable. I can use the language I want. I can use the tooling that I want. But I don't want to run it myself because containers are great, but they're also a lot of work. And you definitely do not want to be the person that's sitting there in your office getting paged because you have to hand deploy your containers to production every time you want to make a significant change. So what we were hearing is that partially managed, like ECS or EKS was great, but it wasn't all the way there. So we built Fargate. So Fargate, underlying technology for container management. So you do not manage the cluster or the infrastructure yourself. You do everything at the container level. So you define it at the container level, and I'll explain what that means. So it just scales seamlessly for you. So takes out another chunk of kind of the managing infrastructure piece, and you just worry about defining your container. And I think what's important for me there is that I don't want to have to create infrastructure to run more infrastructure, because the point that we're getting at is that we shouldn't have to define things at the EC2 level anymore when you're defining your job at the container level. So Fargate just takes in those task definitions, or in 2018, Kubernetes pod, and then you feed it that's your definition, and then the underlying cluster resources are handled for you. So what does that mean for you? It means you don't do any scaling or resource management or cluster setup. You just pass it your task definition or pod, and then Fargate handles the rest of it. How that works in practice. So you end up with two launch types for ECS. So you have the one that's now called EC2, which is ECS, which means you still have control over your cluster resources and the instances that your jobs are placed on. And then you have Fargate. This is a really terrible screenshot, but I have a lot of demo clusters, and it turns out I never do anything exciting in them before I make a new demo cluster. So there's not a whole lot happening here, but you get the picture. So from my same cluster, I have some tasks that are broken down as EC2 or ECS tasks, and some that are broken down as Fargate tasks. These are running, by the way, side by side in the same cluster. But in one of them, I control my underlying pool of resources, and in one of them, I do not. But still defined by that same pattern, which is, in this case, a task definition. So the thing to think about here is, with Fargate, focus on just your workload. So your job, your container, your function, that's it. First, full stop. So don't worry about the infrastructure that goes underneath it. Just worry about what defines your actual job. And I think that that's indicative of the whole kind of field of compute changing, right? So we started off, and everything was at the EC2 level. And that was great when we were building monolithic applications that were directly on the host EC2 system. Or I guess at some point when you were running things on bare metal, and that was what you only had that one box. You didn't have virtual servers. So now I think there's a shift, right, which is that containers are now a fundamental compute primitive. So being able to control things at the container level, so something like a security group, doesn't make sense that much at just the EC2 level anymore. It makes sense at the container level. So I think where we're going now is treat tasks as a fundamental compute primitive. So roles, service roles, security groups, networking, those are all things that belong at the task level and not just the EC2 level. So treat your tasks as kind of fundamental compute primitives, first-class citizens. They get all the same options that you would have had at the EC2 level. So tasks, auto-scaling, load balancer. Oops. It's a delicate ecosystem up here.
It's that Jen.
Well, I don't know. Someone that works at the venue might want to investigate this. For those of you watching on Twitch, this is what I do. Text board. Okay, I'm gonna just leave it for now. Let's all not touch it. Sorry, false alarm. it's the equivalent of, have you tried turning it off and on again? Have you tried unplugging it, waiting 2 seconds, and then plugging it back in? So we're off to the races again. If it happens again, someone just shout out and let me know. You guys saw that one in the break, but things are moving to the task level. Don't even. So, now I'm afraid to change slides because awesome. So we'll hurry up now, just in case my slides disappear again. But the takeaway here, beyond kind of the specific feature level, is what does this enable? And I think what we're really getting at is that it should let you focus on just your workload first. So you shouldn't be creating this infrastructure just in order to run your job, but your job should be defining what your infrastructure looks like. So don't just shoehorn things in to just kind of whatever the standard way of doing things is. Define just your job. Say, I want to run this messaging job, or I want to grab events off a queue, take some action, and then put them somewhere else, possibly back in a different queue. Love queues. But you should be defining that at the workload level. So let your infrastructure support what you're doing at the actual job level. So what are people building with all these containers on AWS? And the short answer, I think, is really everything. Manzo, I'm really sorry about your logo again. I swear I'll fix it. Kind of everything. So just like we saw the segment example where they were running both event architecture and ETL jobs, people are using containers to do pretty much everything in every industry. So from that event processing to cat GIFs with BuzzFeed, to ticket processing with Ticketmaster or online sales with Zalando. Containers, I think, have kind of moved from like, I'll only do my new stuff in containers just in case this whole container thing doesn't work out, to people running their production infrastructures in every imaginable business segment in containers. And more importantly, what does this all mean for you? And the bottom line, I think, is that there's lots of options for running your container workloads on AWS, obviously, because we're talking about all of them. And now we have to have 3 deep dives a day to cover the big ones. And I think beyond that, ultimately a nice charity majors quote, which I just used last night also. So there's no such thing as the right tool. There's only the tool that's right for you. So it doesn't ultimately matter what orchestration tool you use, what language you use, what platform you want to use. What matters is that you can scale it and maintain it, and that it works for your workloads. And on all of them, we'd like AWS to be the best place for you to run your container workloads, however you choose to run them. Why are options important? The first thing is I think they make the community stronger. So ECS and Kubernetes, we all learn things from the presence of the other one. So Kubernetes might do something great that ECS is still working on. ECS might do something better than Kubernetes. So the presence of those options makes the community as a whole stronger. And people banging on things and testing back and forth and playing with them, that helps make every product stronger. And having many different orchestration options that are all really strong is better for all of you because you can use what works best for you. Plus, I said this a couple times, but you don't have to pick one. So part of the benefit of containers is that I can test out all of those tools, and that by their definition, since they're all using kind of that same underlying technology, they're very portable. So I should be able to switch back and forth fairly easily. So what does the whole landscape on AWS look like together? So Amazon ECS, obviously available now. Amazon EKS, which is the Kubernetes one, which is in preview. We have Fargate mode for ECS, which is available now for limited regions. And then we have Fargate mode for EKS, which is coming sometime in 2018. I realize, by the way, that today is also 2018, so not today in 2018. Everyone always thinks they're being smart asking me that. And they're like, did you know that it's February? It's 2018. I did know. So thank you. So let's compare. So ECS. This is the tried and true, the original in lots of regions. I used ECS as a beta customer before I actually came to AWS. And the reason that I started using it was honestly that containers were new and different from me. And I was already trying to sell the engineering team on changing what they had been doing. And this is I think, what got us there, was being able to use AWS services that felt familiar. So things like Route 53 or Autoscaling, CloudTrail, those all felt familiar and kind of tried and tested and true. So that's the big ECS thing. Obviously, scales to support clusters of any size. Container integration, so service integration, so things like different load balancer types or security groups. Those have all moved down to the container level. Quick update on what happened with ECS. These are only what I could fit on the slide, by the way. So what we did with ECS in 2017, a couple different load balancer supports. So you'll now know, if you've looked at the console recently, that there's not just ELB, which is the traditional load balancer. There's also 2 additional ones, so network load balancer and application load balancer, and we'll dig into those. Some UX improvements, supporting some new kinds of jobs, so like cron type jobs and CloudWatch event-based scheduling. Some more regions, Windows containers, added some Linux capabilities, instance draining, so a lot like the traditional instance draining for an auto-scaling group, but at the container level, some support for some additional Docker parameters. 2 themes here, I think. And I'll say this again in the Fargate talk later, but I think there's 2 things that you want to look for from whichever orchestration platform you want to go with. And the first one is sensible defaults. So if I go and start a job without knowing a whole lot about what I'm doing, which is me half the time, how do I know that I can trust my orchestration platform? That if I don't go and choose like resource limits or a logging driver, how do I know that there are sensible defaults from my orchestration platform that will help me take care of the things that I'm not ready to customize yet? So that's one. And then number 2 is, beyond that, will it allow me the flexibility to customize when I do know what I'm doing? So sensible fallbacks and defaults for when I don't know what I'm doing, and then ability to customize and extend when I do know what I'm doing. So I would say that a lot of these features fall in one of those 2 categories, either a sensible default or an allowing me to customize. So something like a lifecycle policy or support for privileged mode are not necessarily things that you need to do. You don't need to choose them. You don't need to customize them. Same with task placement policies. You don't need to do anything about them, but the option is there if you want to customize. So you have the 2 options. And Paul's going to do a deep dive on ECS, so if you'd like to ask him questions about any of those, you can take a screenshot really quick. Paul will answer all of your questions in the deep dive. You're welcome, Paul. EKS, also addressing the question that I know that the preview is limited right now, so are aware of that. We are adding people to it, but if it makes you feel better, I just got access to the preview and I work here. So EKS, which Paul will show you in the Kubernetes deep dive, by the way. So if you have been looking to get into the EKS preview and have not gotten your hands on it yet, Paul has it, and he's going to do a demo. Yeah. Well, maybe he was. Now he is. He is. So if you haven't seen it yet, that's maybe a good opportunity to look at some of the features, see what you can do with it, and that sort of thing. Don't ask Paul if he can get you into the preview faster, because I'm not sure he can. But just tweet at me like everybody else. So what are you looking for from EKS? So managed Kubernetes control plane, high availability, which, as we discussed, thanks to Manzo, is ordinarily quite difficult. Automated version upgrades that you can either opt into or opt out of. So you can opt in, obviously, to us helping you out with the upgrades, or you can not. Same bullet point as ECS, integration with other AWS services. So things like logging platforms, monitoring platforms, VPC, private link, stuff like that. Fargate. So I'm calling this containers on demand, which is not the official way to refer to Fargate. But I think it's think it used to be a very common question, which is, what is the closest that I can get to containers on demand? What is the closest I can get to only telling AWS about my container and nothing else? This is as close as you can get right now. So no infrastructure, someone's getting a phone call. You can launch easily, scale quickly, so it's just the task definition. And then everything's at that container level. So I think the next level of what we've been talking about with things moving from the EC2 level to the container level and the task level, Fargate, I think, is kind of the next step in that. So absolutely everything is at the container level. If you were doing something at the host level, that no longer works on Fargate. So a common thread here. So as we advance and as more of these ECS features, yep. No, it's not. It's back. As soon as that nice guy comes back up here, it'll work again, and then I'll feel bad. The good news is that since Paul's computer has no ports anymore, because thanks Apple, he doesn't have to use his HDMI cable, so I think he might be in a better situation. I swear it's coming back up. There you go. So our common thread here, right? I know. As soon as you walked up here, we were good. It's good luck. Every time it goes out, just walk up here. So our common thread here, supporting more and more at the, and guys, I'll post these slides, by the way. So if you're trying to zoom in from the back on this wall of text, life does not have to be that hard, and the slides will go up, so you can see them that way. Kind of two paths that I see things that are taking. So more control at the task level, our new primitive, and then the alternative path, or in some cases that you can do them side by side, like Fargate and ECS, is more management. So for people saying, run my containers for me, you can either keep customizing or you can get a little extra help with managing them. TLDR, if you're reading these slides afterwards, I'm not going to read this out loud. But summary is, you have a lot of options, and you can, part of how you choose your option is by choosing the level of control that you need. So if you're one of those people that is still SSHing into their cluster hosts as part of their ECS process, Fargate is not here for you. If you've done everything at just the container level, great choice. So depends on the kind of control that you're using, the kind of tasks that you're running, but they all use the same primitive, so ECS and Fargate, and then EKS is obviously the same Kubernetes pods. If you're looking for a little bit more info on how to choose, there's a nice blog post that was written by one of the container developer advocates that breaks out into more detail the differences, yep, Nathan, the differences between some of the different services. So how do you know what's different in all of them, and how do you know which type is right for you? So what's next? So first things first, we like hearing from all of you. We have some things that we're working on, and the place that I see it going is more focus on supporting those same two paths from before. So more focus on supporting these tasks as our compute primitives, and then more focused on the managed side of things as well. So beefing up EKS, managing more things for you in Fargate. Ultimately, though, our roadmap is driven by feedback. So if you're sitting here, you hopefully have some interesting containers, or you just came because everyone else was here, which is also acceptable.
Free food.
Yeah, free food. But our roadmap is driven by feedback. So from issues on the ECS agent, on the GitHub page, from people that write really cool community tools like the Fargate CLI or the Cold Brew CLI, tell your TAM, tell me, tweet at me. But our roadmap is driven by your feedback. And that goes for not just containers products here, but for all the products. So if you have something that you're looking for, something that you want to see, something that you don't think is working quite right, please let us know. So this is my new thing. Obviously, I do everything on Twitter because it works from airplanes very well. So been looking for some feedback recently on what you all are looking for from ECS and Fargate and EKS. And even if I'm not currently running a Twitter poll, still feel free to tweet back at us. I know a lot of people use that AWS wishlist hashtag. We do actually look at that, and actually support looks at that now too. So tons of ways for reaching out. We have a bunch of Slack channels as well. So there's a lot of ways to get in contact with us, but don't be shy. So not only don't be shy on telling us, but don't be shy about writing about it or tweeting about it too, because if you're solving one problem, chances are that at least one other person just in this room is also looking at the same problem, that they could learn something from you and the rest of the community. But first up today, starring a YubiKey token, because I have one of those nano ones that's on the side, and every time I think I'm going to drop my laptop, I catch it, but by the YubiKey token. So we will verbally announce the schedule, which Paul posted beginning of the session anyway, and he did a better job. So after this, we have the deep dive on ECS. So that's Paul, who's very kindly screenshotting my YubiKey mistakes from the back of the room. Followed by, after a little bit of a break, the Kubernetes on AWS. Thank you for laughing at my pain. That's fine. It's expired already, so publish away. So the Kubernetes on AWS talk is more accurately the EKS talk. So we'll have an EKS demo. So not a whole lot on Kubernetes and EC2, but a lot on EKS. 345 will be YubiKey output, the 200 level. Before that, we'll do the deep dive on Fargate. We'll do a little bit of a demo there, but we'll also, I think, for a lot of people, we'll walk through what a lot of the Fargate concepts are, because it does change a little bit on how you can run your container infrastructure, because you do lose some of the same granular control that you get in something like ECS or EKS or Fargate. And then after YubiKey output, we have advanced container management and scheduling. That will be mostly ECS focused, because we'll talk a lot about resource management and task policies, which make the most sense right now for ECS. Beyond today, how can you get started? So I included a preview link for EKS, don't yell at me. I also included some of the getting started and what's new blog posts, because I think it's the best way to kind of see the thoughts around it. So I included some posts. I included something, if you're looking at Fargate, I included one from Liz Rice, who's local, but from Aqua Security. And she wrote something nice when she got her hands on Fargate very early. So she had this post come out around when we launched. So nice point of view from someone that actually moved a couple jobs over there. I think a lot of you probably interact with Nathan Peck already. But his Medium blog has turned into a really nice place for some longer form responses for some of this container stuff. So how to choose the right environment, what are the differences between ECS and Fargate and EKS, some stuff on task management. I also included, so this is obviously an unofficial State of the Union. So I included a link also to the official State of the Union, which is by Deepak Singh, who's the GM of containers at AWS. That has some customer examples. It's from reInvent. He has less HDMI problems than I do on average, but maybe not anymore. This, by the way, I've had a couple questions on what the blue bar was on the top of ECS. That is, I'll talk about it in the Fargate deep dive. That is a link to the Getting Started wizard for Fargate, which is not how you should run your production Fargate infrastructure, but is a really nice place to start if you're looking to get a feel for what you need to change from your container definition to work with Fargate. So we'll walk through all those in the deep dive too. But if you're looking to just get started, that's a good place for that. If you need a little help, so we have some of these community Slack channels. Members of AWS dev teams and service teams are definitely in there. So there's the AWS developers one, and there's the Amazon ECS one. But we're all very friendly, so you should feel free to reach out to us directly or your TAM if you have a question or a comment or feedback or a feature request. But most importantly, please go build things and then please tell us about them. So don't keep them to yourselves. If you built something cool, let us know. We also do lots of, obviously, customers joining at summits and talks and blog posts. So definitely build things, definitely share them with us. I'd say that I would put the schedule back up, but I'll probably put Paul's schedule back up because I think it was more successful. I have left purposely like 15 minutes for questions. So if you have any questions, Paul is also coming up with he has the mic. So if you have a question, raise your hand so Paul can see you, and then he'll carry the mic. He'll carry the mic over. If you are too shy to ask your question on Twitch, we'll also answer questions after this. Yes?
Wait.
Yep.
Is Fargate available on London region?
Fargate, so I'm going to repeat the question for everyone else, sorry,
Okay.
for Twitch. Can they hear on Twitch? Yeah. Asking where Fargate is available for. Right now it is in US East 1. We are working very hard on additional regions. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
We're in the process of Dockerizing our instances. Would you recommend Fargate as the starting point to take the pain away?
I think Fargate is actually a great starting point because it was designed to be pretty easy to move back and forth. So if you decide you need more control over like resource allocation or scheduling, you can always switch the launch type to be EC2. So I think it's an excellent starting point. I actually think starting with Fargate is probably easier than people that have been using it for a couple months already because you're starting with everything at the container level from the beginning. So when I started it 2 years ago, I was very slowly moving features off from the EC2 level to the container level as they came out. I think it's totally worth starting everything at the container level and then switching your launch type to ECS if for some reason you find that you need more control. Yes.
So we're just trying to figure out how containers can actually change our infrastructure. We're a development software house, and we have lots of developers with lots of different operating systems, SQL Server, etc. You can imagine it's a mess. But the lure of containers for me is the fact of simplifying the underlying structure and making something really easy to spin up a test machine, do the testing, delete it, off you go. Is that the right sort of concept that I should be aiming for when it comes to my developers and trying to get their buy-in to this sort of idea?
So I think what made the container migration thing easier for me at the beginning was that because it's that same format, it's very easy to break it up into pieces that feel manageable. So totally a normal path to start. So starting with developer environments is a really common one. Starting with new services is a really common one too, that as you have new functionality, you write it as a microservice in a container instead. And then so I think that's what BuzzFeed has been doing actually, is as they created new services, like I need a dog, they're gonna kill me. I need a new dog GIF service instead of a cat GIF service. So I make my dog GIF service as a microservice, and then my cat GIF service stays as the legacy service, communicating with the dog GIF service when it needs, and then I break out pieces as I need to and move those to containers as well. So either one are totally viable options. I think if what works for your developers is starting off as developer and test environments as they get used to the format, I think that's a totally possible way to do it. Yes.
Sorry, 2 questions. One about the continuous integration. So
yes.
What would you recommend on the continuous integration side for the ECS?
What is my comment on it? It's good. Sorry, I couldn't help it. The comment for continuous integration for ECS. When I started using ECS, there was not a good way to do that with a lot of different CI/CD tools. If I was building it now, I would use code build and code pipeline because I am nothing if not lazy and efficient, and that is the absolute easiest way to do it without having to muck around with secrets and keys. Because generally, I think that my biggest reason for using the managed AWS services is that rotating secrets is a pain in the butt, and anything that I can handle with service roles and IAM roles, it makes me happy. So I would use code build and code pipeline now, which just came out with ECS support. Alternatively, if you were looking for a third-party one, you just need to read carefully because a lot of them have problems with Docker caching because part of having like a public CI/CD system is that you never know what machine it's going to run on. So it can actually increase your build times significantly if they haven't figured out how to do Docker caching. So There's some really great third-party ones out there too. I'd use code build, but if not, just make sure that you read the documentation and some reviews to make sure that they're handling caching in a way that's efficient.
And second question, do you think Fargate would be expensive if we are running a continuous application that needs to be supported for 24/7?
So one of the pricing difference between ECS and Fargate is that one of them is resource-based and that one of them is task-based. I think they're passing the microphone back to Paul, who might have a better answer for this, or he's not doing it. Yeah, never mind. He was giving it to someone else. So it could be, it could not be. It depends on how you're running your task, though. So if it's eating up a ton of resources, possibly more expensive, but it should be pretty comparable. I generally, though, don't run the same task 24/7. If I need to run something 24/7, my service might be up 24/7, but it's not always the same tasks because I don't always have the same level of traffic at 3 a.m. as I do at 8 p.m. So I'm not sure if I 100% understand the use case, but they should be pretty comparable, but it depends on the kind of resources that you're allocating to your Fargate task as well.
I think there's also a TCO conversation there, right? With Fargate, you're not managing operating systems, you're not managing any of the underlying infrastructure, so make sure to factor that into the costings as well when you look into it.
For those of you that can't hear, because I don't know if he has a microphone, there's a TCI cost to weigh in there too, which is that you're passing the buck on a lot of your management for Fargate. So what you pay your ops person to be on call for your servers is also something that you should factor in there too, because you're replacing something that someone was previously on call for 365. Good point, Paul. Did we pass the mic to someone else?
Yeah,
awesome.
Sorry for intercepting.
No, you're fine.
If you're with Fargate trying to take as much of the infrastructure management away as possible, what's the use case for selecting between ECS and EKS when that comes under Fargate?
So my use case so it's a couple different pieces of questions. So between ECS and EKS, I think in a lot of cases that's it's a which orchestration platform did you like? I think between running ECS and EKS in Fargate mode or EC2 mode, which I realize is like a whole acronym soup, but so the difference between Fargate mode and we'll just call it standard mode for EKS and ECS, my biggest one is control. That in a lot of cases, how I worked around things in ECS was by getting into the underlying host. So I run things as daemon processes, or I was doing something in EC2 user data. If I have a use case like that, or that I have, so I mentioned segment earlier is using bin packing. So bin packing, we'll talk about it in resource management, but if you find that boring, here's the quick and dirty. It's basically putting as many containers as closely together as possible to use up every single bit of space on that instance. So if you were looking to do a strategy like that, which involves customizing the host and your scheduling, go with ECS. If you can manage everything at the container level and you're happy with the Fargate defaults, I'd go with Fargate. I don't know if Paul has a different answer.
No, I think you got it right there. There are some use cases that I would choose ECS on EC2, things like GPU, things like Windows containers. Yeah, some more advanced configurations, but in most cases, starting with Fargate, and then when you need the extra customization, flexibility, etc., you can just flip that task definition over to running Fargate.
I think also that once you've gotten to the point where you need to customize things like attaching GPUs or that you're customizing your placement policy, you're at a pretty advanced use case. So chances are at that point you might have other things that you're doing to customize the host beyond just. Another thing about Fargate is network type. So Fargate only uses AWS VPC networking type right now, which means attaching an ENI to each task, which we'll talk about in the deep dive. But Docker obviously has 3 other networking types, so bridge, net, and host. And so those things are not quite equivalent. So if you need a specific networking type, also with ECS.
Got one more.
When you say serverless function and Fargate microservice, which one you will recommend for scalability and the cost-wise?
I think it depends on the use case, right? Like most organizations I speak to, large organizations anyway, have totally valid use case for containers and serverless. I think the community thinks there's this big war, serverless versus containers. Actually, most organizations are using both successfully. The use case generally is if it's event-based. Lambda has lots of event sources available for it that you can trigger and do small event-based processing in real time. Containers, obviously better suited to long-running applications, and there is a blurred line in between. So yeah, work with us. We can help you with your use case, help you choose which technology to use there.
I had a very pleased person come up to me at the London Loft last year and was like, did you know that I could replace all of my container infrastructure with Lambda functions? And I was like, well, sure, you could, and that sounds like so much work. So I think there's definitely different cases where you want to use them. I think Lambda actually makes really excellent glue. So like, I need to do something from this one source, take an action, and then do something else. I think Lambda is really awesome for that. But then if you're getting to the point where you're saying, well, I know you extended the Lambda timeout, but it's still not enough time, perhaps your process doesn't belong in a Lambda function. So it always depends on your use case, though. But there's definitely, you can have both. You do not have to pick between serverless and containers. We all get along just fine.
Any other questions? Yes.
With the move with Fargate to removing the EC2 layer, how will that work with agents we install for third-party monitoring, as an example? So, say Dynatrace or something like that, where we might not be able to install the agent?
If you are installing something directly on the host through EC2 user data, that does not work with Fargate. You'd have to containerize that process and run it through Fargate. So, short answer on that one.
Like a sidecar container or something? Was there a question at the front?
Did you? Yeah, right there.
Let me do this one first. He had his hand up first.
Hi, so we're using Elastic Beanstalk with the multi-Docker variant. The stuff you talked about at the beginning about EKS and so on, is there any impact on Beanstalk, basically? Is what we're doing sort of old school now, or because it uses ECS under the covers, right?
Yeah, so I'm not as up to date on Beanstalk as perhaps I could be. So if Paul has a better answer, he can take that one.
So Beanstalk's a really, really easy way to get started on AWS. You can take a .NET application or some sort of application in a common language and run it with very little effort in Beanstalk. You can use containers. Beanstalk supports containers. What we tend to see is that as customers progress through that journey of, at the beginning I want really, really easy, through to, okay, well now I'm a bit more advanced here, I want more control, more flexibility, maybe I want to bin pack my containers down better onto less hosts. Those are all good indicators that actually you should be looking at ECS or EKS. Fargate is probably the nicest transition point away from Beanstalk into something that gives you more flexibility, more control. So yeah, if you're hitting those kind of issues and you want to get more cost efficiency, more scalability, etc., those are normally good indicators. But we're not deprecating Beanstalk in any way here. We've never deprecated an AWS service. So.
On the ECS, right, let's say we have the service which got the two containers, right? I always have a problem whenever I try to create the cron between container A and container B having the same network. I don't want to go outside, right? I just want to bypass kind of IPC kind of things, like communicating between the network.
Yep.
I always got the problem with the cron. Why is that so? Because if I log on to the container and try to run the cron service, it will work perfectly fine. But if I run from the CI, like let's say drone and launch it, right, it always got the problem. Why is it so?
So around container networking in general, and just what's the easiest way to get containers talking to each other, etc.
Each other on the HTTP or something, internal HTTP network.
Internal HTTP, so communication between containers. This is a really good topic, and I think your Fargate talk is going to cover some of this in terms of the new networking mode.
So yeah, so we will cover AWS VPC networking mode. If you talk too much about networking, the whole room kind of takes a little nap. So I'm only covering that one. Yeah.
Yeah. Like the 2-second thing here is Docker networking, fundamentally, if you look back at the history of Docker, you've got a Docker bridge and different subnets, and your containers will run in the Docker subnet, for example, with bridge mode or host mode, etc. You've got things like in Kubernetes, Calico and Flannel that provide overlay networks and encapsulation and separate networks for your pods and containers. And it's all just extra complexity in a lot of cases. So AWS stepped back and looked at, okay, how can we make this as simple as possible for our container customers to do networking on our platform? So both for EKS and ECS and Fargate, we released the AWS VPC Networking mode. So what this will do is it will give each container, or each task or pod in Kubernetes, its own native VPC IP address, which means that there's no translation, there's no natting, there's no IP tunneling or encapsulation. So you can use all your standard tooling to diagnose problems like ping, traceroute, TCP dump. You don't have to hop through multiple networks, and you don't get a performance overhead because it's just raw VPC networking. Everything gets an IP address, everything can talk to other boxes on other hosts directly. So we're going to cover that networking mode in more detail in some of the deep dives and take you through it. But that's probably the simplest and most performant way of doing container networking on our products today.
So if you're having an issue with it too, I would say that like the number one networking problem for people with containers is that it's not always connected the way that you think. So like you can use host where it shares the host network, but you also have none, so none. And then you have bridge, you have the overlay networks in Kubernetes. So it's not always connected the way that you think. So like either the port's not being mapped where you think it's being mapped, or it's not using the networking type. That's the most common. And then at some point you end up with a load balancer in front of it too. So things are not mapped correctly the way that you're thinking, and that is often the problem. Well, my problem is always that I've forgotten to expose the port in the security group 99% of the time, but
yeah, sorry.
My problem is cron is not firing up by default on the container itself or the environment, and
Docker is not meant to run crons.
Yeah.
That's architectural problem.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
You should use task events that actually fire your task, not running crons inside the Docker.
Okay.
Yeah, I think one of the nice patterns on AWS, if you're looking for scheduled containers, is to actually use CloudWatch events as the scheduler, as the cron scheduler for your containers. So within the AWS console, you can go to CloudWatch events, set like a cron-like pattern, so every minute, every 5 minutes or whatever, and actually trigger a task in ECS and run your scheduling that way, rather than actually having a long-running container that just does cron inside.
So just to be clear, though, there is nothing technically preventing you from running cron in your container, but that's not what the container was set up for, because then you have to, for cron, you have to basically keep that same container up running all the time, because if it starts or restops or is replaced, then your cron job isn't working the way that it thought it was, because it has to keep track of the time. But you can do cron functions, so things that serve the exact same purpose as your traditional cron job. You can run those in containers. I just wouldn't use, you could, but I wouldn't use the traditional cron.
As cron, but I need to fire up manually. That's
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's come find us during lunch or during the break, and we can dive a bit deeper into that if you want and help.
So we have, I believe it is technically the deep dive in a half an hour on ECS. So if you have any questions after this, or if you're in a rush to get coffee, please push and shove out the door as efficiently as possible. If you have a question that either you didn't want to ask on Twitch or you didn't get a chance to ask, we'll be up here for a couple minutes afterwards. But if not, we'll see you back at 11:30 for the ECS deep dive.